this is Dave Janis's 10th speech. But he's pretty sure that he's made additional speeches along the way over his roughly 3 years with TGIF. Nevertheless, Dave hopes that during his 8 to 10 minutes today that he'll inspire his audience with his number 10 speech for to become a competent communicator. Big round of applause, please. He's going to inspire his audience by reflecting back on a situation that helped define him as a person. Please welcome Dave as he will be remembering Mr. Frank Van Dusen. Welcome, Dave.
Today I didn't wear a suit. Bummer.
Morning.
10th speech, finally. Inspire this audience. Tough. But I hope I can do that with a story today about discovering who I was, who I am, the core values that I have. And hopefully I can inspire you to do the same with yourselves. And if you've done that already, to inspire you to stay true to who you really are. This story starts with one of my first jobs that I had. I worked at Mercy Hospital in my hometown of Jackson, Michigan. I worked there while I was a junior and senior in high school and all 4 years in college. I worked in the X-ray department, probably radiology today, and I had a variety of tasks to do, but one of my important tasks was to transport patients to and from their room down to the X-ray department and back. Now you can imagine that over 6 years of doing this, I met a lot of people. For a young person, it was very interesting to meet all these people. And I can tell you with great confidence that 100% of these people did not want to be in the hospital. Nobody wants to be in the hospital. Now, some people were there for very minor things and they weren't there for very long, but other people were there for very serious things, and some people never left the hospital. But it was an interesting study of human nature because I saw people under adversity and how they all handled it. And I learned a lot about people at a very young age. I learned about myself, too. So let's go to June 1975, and I had just finished my freshman year in college, and I was back at the hospital to work for the summer, and there was an X-ray request for a gentleman, Mr. Frank Van Dusen. I took my wheelchair, went up to the second floor to get Mr. Van Dusen, and there he was in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, still dressed in his street clothing, suitcase unpacked on the end of the bed, his wife sitting in the chair. Mr. Van Dusen had clearly just been admitted to the hospital. I introduced myself. He popped up off the bed, shook my hand, introduced himself, and said, "Dave, I've been expecting you. Let's go. Let's do this X-ray. And by the way, do you mind if I walk rather than ride in the wheelchair?" Now the interesting thing is, we weren't together all that long. Down the hall to the elevator, downstairs, back up. But during that short amount of time together, Mr. Van Dusen asked me a lot of questions about me. He asked me how long I'd worked at the hospital. What did my job entail? Was I in school? Where did I go to school? What was I studying? He was very interested in me. And not from an interrogation standpoint, but he was curious about me. That made me feel good. Well, over the course of the next few months in the summer, I got to know Mr. Van Dusen pretty well, and he was a great guy. Well, come September, it's time for me to go back to school, and I had one more X-ray to get for Mr. Van Dusen before I left. And at that time, he said, "Dave, how about if I ride in the wheelchair today? I'm a little tired." Okay, that's why I brought it. So now fast forward a couple of months to Thanksgiving, where I came home for the long Thanksgiving break from college and wanted to earn some spending money, so back to the hospital to work. I was pretty sure that Mr. Van Dusen was long gone, back home, healthy and happy. But unfortunately, there was an X-ray request to get Mr. Frank Van Dusen for an X-ray. I grabbed my wheelchair, went up to see him. Unfortunately, Mr. Van Dusen couldn't go on a wheelchair this time. He needed to ride on a stretcher. So I pulled him over on the stretcher, and he was very excited to see me. And he asked me how college was going, how are my studies, and how was everything else in my personal life. He was interested in me, and yet here was a man who was in the hospital. Thanksgiving vacation is short. It's time for me to go back to school. So for the last 3 to 4 weeks of the semester, I went back to school and came back for the winter vacation. And again, back to work to earn some spending money. And there was a request to get Mr. Frank Van Dusen for an x-ray. I went up to his room. The room was dark. Shades were drawn. Lights were off. No one else in the room. Curtain pulled around his bed. I called out his name. He didn't respond. I came around the curtain. Called out his name. He didn't respond. I told him it was me. He didn't respond. I looked at Mr. Van Dusen, and as my eyes adjusted to the lighting in the room, I could see that he had deteriorated a lot in the last 3 to 4 weeks that I had been gone. He wasn't sleeping. In fact, he looked like he was in a coma. Lots of wires and tubes attached to his body. Monitor showing that he was alive, but to me, not a medical person, he looked like he was about to die. It struck me at that point. Here I have this x-ray order to do my job. Somebody, an authority figure, medical expert, said, get this man for an x-ray. And I looked at him and realized that I have compassion and care for people in my heart. That I look at people and I take them for who they are, and I try to understand their circumstance. And I realized that was my core person. That's who I was made of. And something empowered me at that time to walk out to the nurse's station and say, 19-year-old person, I have an x-ray order here for Mr. Van Dusen. I'm not going to take him for an x-ray. They were like, what? You've got an order from the doctor. I said, have you looked at him? The guy's unresponsive. He looks like he's dead. Can't we just leave him in peace? Can't we just leave him in comfort? What's this x-ray going to do? Well, they were pretty upset because they were trained to follow orders, and they said, well, we'll have to call the doctor, tell him. And I said, well, call me when Mr. Van Dusen wakes up and he's ready to go. So I went downstairs, and of course I was nervous. I was nervous for Mr. Van Dusen. I was nervous because I was probably going to get fired. I went downstairs and told my boss what I'd done. He said, okay, why don't you just keep doing your job, and I'll talk to the nurses. So I went about my business during the day, transporting people back and forth, etc. Worried about Mr. Van Dusen, worried about my job. Towards the end of the day, the department secretary waved me down and said, Dave, I have a message for you from the nurses on the second floor. They wanted you to know that Mr. Van Dusen died today. Well, I was sad, of course, for Mr. Van Dusen's family. I got to know his wife, his brothers and sisters, his children, his grandchildren, his neighbors and friends. I was sad for Mr. Van Dusen, a guy who I saw 6 months before walking in the hospital. He was chipper, full of vim and vigor. Here he was 6 months later, dead. But I learned at that point that deep down in my core, that my gut was right about not taking him for that x-ray. That I valued him as a person. That I looked at his situation and said, you know, this isn't right. Even though the authority figure says this isn't right. And so I felt very good about that. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you that I've stuck to that principle all my life and all my business career. And I can tell you for sure, and you all know this, it is not easy putting the other person first in the business world. I've got a to-do list, I've got goals, I've got things I got to get done, and it takes time to invest in the other person. But I've stuck to that through my whole career because people are important, and getting to know them and what they think about and what they value and what's their circumstance and what's important to them is important. I can also tell you as a manager, the outcome of these interactions are not always going to be good. Sometimes bad things happen in the world of business. But I always felt good that if I took the time to appreciate and respect the other person, that the best possible outcome would happen. So that's my story, and I encourage you to look deep in yourself and make sure that you understand who you are and be true to that, because you are who you are for a reason, and the world is a better place for you. Thank you very much.